What is going on, everyone? It is Hadex Gaming back again, and this time I wanted to do a tier list on the bosses of Necesse. This will be purely my own opinion and ranking them based on their design, boss mechanics, loot, and difficulty in terms of progression. I'll also have the boss comparisons on screen from the old designs to the new designs, but I will only be ranking them on their new designs only. So once again, these are only my opinions, and if anything is different to yours, then let me know. So let's get into it with the first boss, the Evil's Protector. In terms of design, I'd probably rank this a C tier, as no one really knows what it is. Some say it's an imp, a moth, a demon, or a devil. It also just has one eye and wings, so it is quite hard to figure out. It is called an Evil's Protector, so I would agree with maybe imp, and it does spawn imps, but that is why it gets a C tier for design. And then in terms of the boss mechanics, it has lots of dodging, 2 alternating phases, and can be fought within a settlement, so it is fairly forgiving as a first boss, and because of that, I kind of want to bump it up to a B tier. Where it gets interesting is its loot. It gives early class items in the forms of the melee, range, summon, and magic foci, allowing you to specialize in one type, or you can combine all of them for a balanced one, so you can hybrid. The fact that this is obtainable from the very first boss in the game bumps this up to an A tier for me, leaving the Evil's Protector at an A tier. Next up is the Spider Queen, and as far as the design goes, it is a giant spider that you would never want to go near in real life. So it does do a good job in getting that fear or gross factor across, whilst looking menacing. I'm gonna pop it in maybe A tier for design, probably under the Evil's Protector for now though. Jumping into the mechanics, I dislike that it summons smaller spiders and can climb over walls, making it impossible to hit. That being said, it is a spider, so it does make sense. So I'm gonna leave it in A tier for now. But then in terms of difficulty, it's got some mechanics that can pose a threat if you take too long, such as too many spider minions, too much venom, but it is manageable and you do get opportunities to attack it while it's stationary. It can quite often be seen as a very easy boss fight and will be the boss that most people will fight to obtain the achievement Too Easy, which is killing a boss in 30 seconds or less. This is due to having no phase changes, so you can power through it and kill it quickly. I'm going to drop it down to a B tier. And then for the loot, it doesn't drop anything too crazy or useful, so I'm going to drop it down a further tier to C tier. Following the spider is the first boss to have its own island and dungeon spawn, being the Void Wizard. His design is very similar to another boss, and even the village elder is similar to his design. And due to that, it would be cool to have some lore to tie them all together, because he is just a wizard. And then during a second phase, he upgrades to this flying form with tendrils, which you don't see anything of, really. So because of this, I'm going to rank him at B tier. And then as for his mechanics, this is a fun boss. It introduces a large amount of bullet hell and feels like a fun fight for any type of class. However, I do think its moveset needs to be adjusted to better suit its look. The first phase and bullet hell can stay the same. However, in the second half, I'd love to see it spawn tendrils and tentacles, or even utilize the arena to its advantage. The next point isn't quite mechanics based, but more lore based. But I also like to think that the Elder is the Void Wizard and the Void Wizard is the Fallen Wizard, due to the fact that the achievement for defeating the Fallen Wizard is called Rematch. This has never been confirmed by anyone, but I like to think that's the case, and because of that, I'm going to give it an A tier, just for that kind of background lore. In terms of loot, the Void Wizard drops a handful of magic weapons, making him almost a worthless fight if you aren't a mage class, but it does drop an empty pendant, allowing you to get an extra trinket slot, making it a worthwhile fight and redeeming itself. So I think I'm going to keep it at A tier, as there just isn't a huge wow factor in terms of loot, mechanics, or design. Nothing too special to bump it up to S. Moving on to the swamp, we get the Swamp Guardian. It's a giant spiky earthworm which sheds its skin into razor discs when attacked. Not only is it super fitting for the swamp, but it's just such a unique design with earthy swamp tones, and looks like it's just one big mutation of the swamp. So I'm gonna pop it under A tier, just below the Void Wizard. And then factoring in its mechanics and loot, this thing digs underground and charges you head on, but also the more damage you deal to it, the more razor discs shoot out of it. And then for the loot, it drops a melee item, a shield trinket, and a magic weapon. This gives the drop some diversity, and I think this just bumps it up above the Void Wizard in terms of overall. Like, it's the first boss that utilizes the floor and digging under the ground. So I think this is a good spot for it. Next up, we have the 5th boss in the game, and it's the only other boss that can be fought in a settlement on the surface. This is the ancient vulture, which can be fought in the desert caves or the desert surface. The design on this boss is amazing. It's got such a good graphical rework from the old graphics between the baby vultures and its own design. The sharp claws and the beak, the sun-shaped scruff around its neck truly showcase it's meant to be a desert boss, so I'm giving this an S tier ranking for design. As for the fight itself, this can be as tough or as easy as you want to make it. You could choose to fight it in the desert caves by smashing an ancient statue, or you could summon it on the surface, or even a settlement village to get assistance from the villagers. This boss to me feels like it just makes sense. It feels like you're being swooped by a vulture and you're fending it off. But we have seen the minions spawning before from the Evil's Protector and the Spider boss, and we'll probably mention it a few more times with other boss mechanics. And because of that, I'm dropping it from an S tier to an A tier, but probably on the higher end, as there's no mechanics which make it a super memorable fight. And then in terms for the loot, this is oddly enough the first boss that drops a cosmetic, which isn't ever a confirmed drop. So it is pure chance that you could get this item. And then it also drops alongside that 3 very good weapons. The Vulture's Talon, which is a spear which has high range and high damage. The Vulture's Burst, which is the first bow to do piercing damage and high damage at that. And then the Vulture summons, which are your best summons until quite later in the game. So with all that, I'm keeping it at A tier, as there is nothing that sets it apart in a unique way from the other bosses that would make it stay on S tier, but it definitely sits at the highest point of A tier. For the last early game boss, we have the Pirate Captain, and this is the first of only 3 necessary bosses to beat the game. You don't need to defeat all the other bosses in the game, but you do have to defeat the Pirate Captain to get into the deep caves of the game. That makes it an essential fight, which means in terms of design and fight and loot, it would really need to make it unique as it gatekeeps the rest of the game. So graphically, the pirate comes with its own island with pirates armed at the ready and a stylist held captain. The pirate also has 2 phases. The first is on foot, and the second about 30% into the fight, he becomes a Flying Dutchman style boss shooting cannonballs at you. I might be a bit harsh on this boss, but I'm gonna pop it into D tier, and I can explain that, but it's due to my biased opinion of wanting a content blocker boss to be more unique. Like, it blocks content, so you do need to fight it, and you do want to feel that sense of progression. So just to get into why I put D tier more, Necesse up until this point has made you explore forest and plains, the snow, the void dungeon, which is a variant on the forest or plains biome, the swamp, the desert, and now back to a forest or plains variation with the Pirate Captain. So to traverse to all of these locations, you've either needed to go by boat, flippers, or swimming. So seeing an ocean biome with a huge pirate ship or even a wooden floating fortress that you have to sail up to would be super cool. And then you could incorporate a deep sunken biome too. But even if they were to have the boss utilize the biome better, would be cool. And I'll get into that next. I could almost do a full video on the Pirate Captain and its biome, so let me know if you want to see that. But the Pirate Captain graphically gets a D tier. And just to clarify, I'm not going off the art style, as it does look really good for what its design is, but more of a gameplay sense, which is why it gets that D ranking. Moving on to the mechanics, I mentioned earlier it gets a flying phase too, which is something other games have done before, such as the Flying Dutchman and something like that. So something new would be really cool to see. The 2 phases aside, the boss also summons an infinite amount of pirates and macaws, the pirate birds. What I'd probably also like to see is the macaw be a part of the boss and the captain. Have them share a HP bar or be part of the mechanic without spawning more minions. And then on that note, the infinite pirates that assist would be really cool if they arrived by boats to assist rather than just spawning in. So mechanics wise, we've seen it fly over walls so you can't hit it and just spawn minion after minion, which the other bosses have also done. So I'm keeping it at D tier. And then for the loot doesn't do too well for it either. On your first kill, you get a pirate sheath to give you another armor set slot. And yes, it does drop the deep ladder, which is essential to progress, but the rest of the loot isn't too great either. You get a hand cannon, which doesn't compete with other ranged weapons at that point, a telescope trinket, which extends the travel and biome view by 1, which sounds good on paper, but I'll get to why it's a waste of a trinket slot soon, and spare boat parts to make a steel boat that extends travel distance by 2 as well. Now, travel distance is nice, but with travel scrolls, it eliminates you needing to travel by boat, so you would never need a better boat or to travel further distance until more biomes and rarer biomes are introduced into the game to make them worthwhile. Now, if we had a deep sunken biome, which is flooded with, let's say, radioactive or toxic water, then a steel boat would be critical in staying afloat to traverse it. So for a boss that you 100% need to kill to progress the game, in my opinion, it needed to be an S tier boss in terms of spawning, mechanics, graphics, and loot to make it stand out as the turning point in progression. So because it's got none of that going for it, I'm going to keep it at D tier. Moving on to the first of the deep mode bosses is the Reaper. This boss mechanically is really interesting and graphically just fits. So first of all, the Reaper naturally has a huge scythe and levitates, which is only fitting as it is a spectral being. Next, it's set in a spooky underground area that is flooded with ghosts and skeletons, so it makes even more sense for the boss to be of the undead kind. So I'm going to pop it probably mid A tier, if not high A tier for that. And then mechanically, this boss is somewhat unique in its moves. I want to get out of the way first that it does spawn minions. They are little orbs that come out during parts of the fight, but I feel like if they were turned into lost souls or ghosts, it would be much more fitting and would make sense that a Reaper would be spawning those souls. So for that, I'm just going to drop it down to B tier. And then for his other mechanics, he uses his huge scythe to dash at you. And then in the second phase, he phases in and out and uses his scythe like a boomerang, throwing it and then catching it. But moving into the deeper areas of the game, this boss really does need to prove to be much harder. In terms of the loot is very good for all aspects of the game. It has a Death Ripper machine gun for the rangers, which can be a top tier gun, a Reaper Scythe, which is arguably one of the best melee weapons in the game, the Reaper's Call, which summons the same orbs as the boss did. So I'd also like to see this get a graphical rework and turned into a soul or ghost kind of sprite. And then a Shadow Beam for mages, which is also another top tier weapon for mages. So because of that, I want to bump it up to A tier again, somewhere between the Vulture and the Evil's Protector. So probably here. Next, we'll be moving into the deep variant of the snow biome for the ice boss. This is the Cryo Queen. I just want to state that this boss got one of the best makeovers during the graphics update, making it look like an elegant cryogenic queen rather than just a blue ice princess. Ignoring the glow up, the boss's design is great, but this boss does pose to be a melee class's nightmare. This boss utilizes distance to shoot icicles at you and summons icicle quakes that almost fan out in a snowflake-like spiral pattern, or I'll just shotgun ice shards at you to deal bulk damage. The Cryo Queen fits her description and makes sense to be in the coldest reaches of the game. So I'm going to go with A tier between the Reaper and the Evil's Protector. Actually, I'm going to bump it up above the Reaper as well. I do really like the design of this boss, but there's a few things that I want to change, and I'll get into that shortly. So in terms of the mechanics, I mentioned she is a nightmare for melee users, and you'll very rarely get the chance to do close proximity damage, but if you do, you'd also be in range for her shotgun blasts, which would deal a ton of damage. On easier difficulties, this is manageable, but it's a death sentence on the harder ones, and near impossible as a true non-projectile melee user. In terms of mechanics, I'm bumping it down from an A tier to a B tier, just due to the fact that whilst her attacks are ice-based, they don't quite give off the ice vibe, except for the design of the projectiles. I'd recommend turning her shotgun attack to an icicle spear that she launches and summons and then yeets at you, or a cavern shake that drops icicles from the ceiling, or even she summons puddles of water that act as traps, so when you run onto them, they crystallize and turn into ice spikes. This would really show the cryogenic powers that the queen possesses. And then finally for loot, she oddly enough drops two top tier melee weapons, a spear and a glaive, but then leaves much more to be wanted from a close quarters magic weapon and a cryo blaster that just doesn't perform in the tier it should be. So I'm dropping her to the low end of the B tier, or just B tier in general, as this is the first boss that I reckon sits in B tier, just kind of neutral. So when you think of the deep swamp, you probably think bugs, mosquitoes, maybe alligators, but the boss is indeed a giant caterpillar, or maybe a centipede. I'm not 100% sure on the anatomy of the boss, but this boss is called the Pest Warden, which is a fitting name for a bug that eats smaller insects. My concern isn't against the biome, but the design wise of the boss. So in design wise, this boss fits the deep swamp. It's a boss that's unique in a way that it attacks, and the design just makes sense. It coils and wiggles, and it's just a giant bug entity which I can't fault. So I'm giving it a generous S tier for design. In terms of the mechanics, I do find that at the point in the game, the fight is very manageable, but you do need to come at it with enough potions or a certain strategy to counteract the boss. The boss has a coil mechanic where all the damage that you deal becomes 1 or 2 damage, and after it finishes coiling you, you get stuck in the coil and it charges at you. This to me feels like a very unfair mechanic, as you have no way to escape this attack and sometimes nowhere to hide. Later on in the game, you can get an item that lets you teleport to a location a short distance away, and to me, that item would be better off being given before this boss to help assist with the fight. Not to mention, the recoil can bounce you from one part of its body to another and cause instant death, making this fight feel very unfair. No. Why? This boss is rigged. So I'm gonna drop it straight down to a B tier. So every boss can be done without taking damage if you're skilled enough, and I feel like this boss is just too inconsistent with its dashes to let you safely avoid all the attacks. So in my opinion, on brutal mode, it's less about skill and sometimes more about luck that you don't get wombo comboed into oblivion and end up playing pinball across its body. So I've skipped A tier and it goes straight to B tier. As for the loot, it drops an item for each class, making its loot pool super diverse, but the range, melee, and summon item can also be considered to be top tier. The magic weapon though is not so great, so I'm gonna leave it at B tier, but maybe high-end B tier. Next, we have my favorite boss, and I don't say that in a biased way, I can definitely back it up, but straight away, I'm taking Sage and Grit and sticking them in S tier. And before going further, this is the second of 3 bosses that you need to beat the game, as it is a content blocker similar to the Pirate Captain. So as I mentioned with the Pirate Captain, it would need to sit in S tier to make it a worthwhile fight. So to begin with, this is 2 bosses with 1 summon, Sage and Grit, the 2 dragons, and everything about this design screams yin and yang. You have Sage, the blue dragon, representing air, and Grit, the orange dragon, representing the earth. During the fight itself, they have a very poetic movement to them and coordinate their attacks. Not to mention, this arena is central to a giant underground civilization with spanning tunnels, so it does feel like they are protecting something. But more so, they are summoned by a giant fire chalice using a dragon's soul. Even once you defeat them, they open a chamber to the final story boss, and I say story loosely, but it's more like the final quest boss. But once you defeat Sage and Grit, a staircase opens up and they deem you worthy to fight that final boss. They do feel like they are the champions and protectors of the area, and the design itself almost has enough lore just around the fight, location, and biome that it's memorable enough to be like, yeah, I beat them, I can now progress, I've earned it. So getting into the mechanics, they go hand in hand with the design, and they coordinate their attacks, either taking shots on their own or targeting you together in kind of like a dragon dance. They finally also spiral the player, and each have a colored fire that they clash together. And then on top of all of that, as you kill one, it makes the other enraged, making them seem to be angry or in revenge of their fallen partner. So to me, it all stays in S tier. Moving on to the loot for the boss, you get the Bow of Dualism, which is just fitting as Sage and Grit. So obviously it's got 2 of them, the dual aspect, and they shoot orange and blue arrow streams to mimic the dragons. Next, you get a top tier magic weapon, the Dragon Lance, which is just a giant laser beam. It just looks cool and is not like any of the other items we've seen in the game up to this point. The melee users get a Dragon's Rebound Boomerang, which can be thrown an unlimited amount of times, and it mimics the blue and orange trails. And then finally, they also drop a summon weapon, so 1 for every class, and the design-wise for the summon weapon is a tad lacking. It's just skeletons, but they do alternate between melee and range, and are some of the best summons in the game. If anything, I'd make the summons dragons, but it's not enough to drop them down a tier. So to me, they are staying S tier by a long shot at this rate. Next up is the Fallen Wizard. This is the final story or quest boss before the post-game content. If the game had a credit screen, it would probably be after you beat this boss, and then the rest would be post-game. But the game has no credits as of yet. So the Fallen Wizard to me is the follow-up and rematch fight for the Void Wizard, as I mentioned earlier, and the design of this boss is amazing. You beat Sage and Grit, you go through one last dungeon going even deeper, and then you come face to face with a wizard in the middle of a lava sunken arena. Whilst I would give it an S tier ranking, the boss itself doesn't pose a final boss looking design, and even mechanics wise, he doesn't seem powerful enough to be that final boss. So I'm gonna go low end A tier. So let me explain. The mechanics for this boss are interesting enough, and they do actually utilize the arena. This is probably the first boss to utilize the arena in its entirety, and the Fallen Wizard performs a huge void laser beam, which sweeps around the arena. And this can be avoided by hiding behind the staircase or the fire chalices around the room. This attack makes the Fallen Wizard seem super powerful, but the boss has a nasty habit of attacking and running away and then summoning dragons to assist. As a final boss, I'd like to see away with the minions and have a boss aggressively target the player around the arena instead. So I almost want to drop it down to B tier for that, maybe, until it can utilize the arena and be more aggressive. So I think I'm gonna drop it down to low end B tier, or high end B tier, sorry. And then when it comes to the loot, I unfortunately have to drop it down to the bottom of C tier as well. As it's a final boss, it just drops no new weapons, no new armor, no new trinkets. Just an item to increase your trinkets by 1 and 1 to increase your armor set slots. Yes, they are super useful to the player, but even a cosmetic set, a unique trinket, or something to show off the fact that you beat the final boss would be really nice to see. In terms of difficulty, for the boss, it is a tough boss and does need a few attempts to learn, so I think it can stay at C tier, but maybe go just above the spider boss. So whilst the Fallen Wizard was the last final boss of the game, there is post-game content which the Fallen Wizard opens up afterwards, and these are done through incursions. So there's 6 more bosses to go. First up is the Mother Slime. The Mother Slime would be next for in an incursion portal in a radioactive swamp. The design of this boss is a giant slime that bounces around and causes quakes or splatters of toxic spots and tries to squish the player. I'd give it a B in design, but maybe a low B in design, because it is just a giant slime. Like, you can't make it any better than what it is. And then for the mechanics, it summons more slimes, it drops slimes, it slams the user, and it's all pretty generic slime boss shenanigans that other games have done and that we've seen before. So what I'd like to see is it shrink in size as its HP gets smaller, or increase in size as it absorbs other slimes to gain HP, so that you can kind of see where you're at with the boss depending on its size. So the less health, the smaller, the more health, the bigger, and have the boss change in size and shape. So I'm going to drop it down to a mid C tier, and that's because the drops for this is just slime essence and it's nothing crazy, but the incursion bosses don't usually follow a generic path that you defeat the boss, you get loot. It's kind of, you defeat the boss, you complete the incursion, then you get loot. So in terms of drops, the slime only drops its own essence, but in saying that, that essence can be crafted without ever defeating the boss. So I'm gonna keep it at C tier for loot as well. Next up is the Crystal Dragon. I love the idea of a Crystal Dragon. However, the design is very much just another worm boss. It flies around similar to Sage and Grit, and the design has no wings and is essentially a one-on-one Sage or Grit fight. So I'm gonna pop this straight to D tier, but still above the captain, if it'll let me. There we go. So yes, the design looks like it's made out of pearlescent diamonds, but having it cycle through 4 phases of colors for the different gem types would be really amazing and unique that we haven't seen before. There's so much potential for this fight. You could have phase 1, a sapphire dragon, and have it a magic-based dragon on 4 feet. In phase 2, you can have it a summoner focused, and it spawns enemies that protect its defenses. Similar to the ruby shields for the player, have it stop direct impact damage, so you'd have to defeat things in the way of the boss so you could inflict damage. Phase 3 could be the emerald dragon and have it shoot ranged fireballs or gem shards and make it have quick movements. And then for phase 4, it could go into this crystal dragon that it currently is and have it kind of break down over the fight. So phase 1, it's got 4 feet, it's got wings. Phase 2, have it lose 1 wing. Phase 3, lose another wing. And then phase 4 would just be the crystal dragon that's left. But the fight consists of it flying circles and spawning enemies and occasionally shooting shards and using laser beams. This almost feels like a 1v1 Sage or Grit fight as if they were on their own, but I find the enemies it spawns does most of the damage to the player, and it's more of just a tank boss with lots of HP, lots of defense, until the enemies kill you instead of the dragon. This boss doesn't actually drop anything, but the crystal armor you get from this incursion is some of the best and most unique in the game. So whilst it's not a direct drop, it is important to note that I can't judge it too much on its loot. So it does stay in D tier, but still above the pirates. So next up is the Spider Empress. This boss and its biome is incredibly done. They definitely took the time with this one. The Empress looks almost like a marionette or a puppet mastermind, which makes sense as it pulls on webs and strings. She looks like royalty and she looks threatening. The spider aspects make her feel super creepy and super eerie still. She also stands in front and is summoned in front of a giant throne in a spider castle, so her design goes straight to S tier. During her boss fight, she has 2 phases and she rotates in and out of like an enraged form while utilizing her web and venom and spider speed. Whilst the fight introduces no extra mechanics, I'm still giving her an S tier purely for the design and concept. And then as for the loot, the incursion bosses don't drop loot. They are awarded for completing the incursion, so I can't rate on that. But she does have a small chance to drop her mask as a cosmetic helmet, so she is one of the only incursion bosses with their own unique loot still. And because of that, she stays at S tier, and I'd almost place her higher than Sage and Grit, except for the fact that Sage and Grit is such an important fight in the game. It is a mandatory fight, and they've just done so well at making you feel like you've accomplished something after you've fought them. So she stays just behind Sage and Grit. So then moving on to the third last, and quite possibly one of the most unique bosses, is the Night Swarm. This isn't just one boss, it's an entire swarm of enemies. This boss is found in a graveyard biome and focuses on the whole vampiric aspect of vampires. They are a swarm of vampire bats in a graveyard of eternal night. I give them an S tier, purely for the fact it's a coordinated swarm of singular enemies. And then moving on to the mechanics, this swarm's movements are coordinated and they go through a cycle and pattern of movements that can easily be predicted to counteract this boss. This is one of those bosses where skill is equal to the time spent learning the moveset. I also want to mention that the boss doesn't die until every single last bat has been defeated. It's not just a shared health bar and they all die when the HP bar hits 0. You have to defeat every single one of them before it dies. So this is an S tier boss for me. And then as always for the loot, the incursion has vampiric items, but they aren't dropped by the boss, so I'm not going to rank it on that. So definitely S tier, but not as high as the others. Next up, we have the Moonlight Dancer. So this boss comes with its own custom arena, a moon-shaped head, and cosmic robes with stars on them. This Moonlight Dancer almost has a jester look to them, but also a powerful sorceress. S tier in design and location. As for the fight, I'm instantly going to keep it at the top of S tier as well. This boss has a moon that follows the player, as this boss's movements aren't crazy sporadic, so they force the players to continue to move whilst dealing damage. And then this boss is the only boss in the entire game to introduce its own mechanic. This boss calls forth the stars, and you need to collect them to gain a protective barrier to avoid the attack. As far as I'm aware, all the other bosses just have phase changes or different attack patterns. This boss adds an extra mechanic, making it an S tier as well. And as one of the last bosses in the game, the difficulty is right on point. Not too much damage, not too aggressive, everything can be predicted, and it just feels really well balanced. So overall, she stays in S tier. This boss also has her own unique armor set, the Dusk armor, which changes mechanics depending on day or nighttime. And another thing that only up to this point, it is the only armor that does this. So she stays right at the top of S tier. She has a unique look, a unique arena, unique mechanics, unique armor. So every single thing is unique to this boss fight, which makes this probably the highest ranked boss in the game. Moving on to the final boss of the game is the Sunlight Champion. The design on this guy reminds me of Sauron from Lord of the Rings, combined with that new Elden Ring boss. I don't know his name, I've never played the DLC, but I'm sure I'll have it up on screen so that you can see it. But as the name suggests, it's a champion, and it does have that Roman gladiator vibe going on, like it fought lions in an arena and helped the Spartans. The initial impressions is, wow, this arena just flashbanged me, but looks impressive. So I'm gonna pop it in S tier for the arena and the boss's design, as it is unique. However, the downside to this arena is that the boss's colors mixed in with the arenas make this a tougher fight than it needs to be, as trying to keep track of the lava in the center, the boss's flying limbs as if it's Rayman on steroids, and the proximity explosions make it very tough to see everything. So whilst it is unique and great looking, the colors all blend together and make things tough to see. So I'm gonna drop it down to mid to high A tier. As for the mechanics of this boss, it's just avoid its arms and avoid its body and don't get caught in the explosions. And that's it. There's nothing fancy, just a raw feat of strength. This boss has insane amounts of HP, moves far too much and too quickly, and its arms hit like a truck. This is easily the hardest boss in the game, and quite often I find myself thinking it's unfair as it's tough to see what's where. I'm gonna drop it to a B tier as well. However, it does redeem itself to an A tier by having a unique armor set. It's similar to the Dusk armor, but this one drops the Dawn armor, which changes depending on if it's night or daytime. So that's my take on all the bosses and ideas, but as I mentioned in the video, if you want a video where I explain how I would rework the pirate boss and the pirate biome, or if you want to see me rank all the biomes based on their loot, trinkets, bosses, things like that, let me know and I'll do a similar video to this one. But I hope you all enjoyed my thoughts and rankings on these bosses, and as always, if you have your own thoughts, let me know down in the comments. Otherwise, have a great time zone, so that means good morning, good evening, or good night, depending on wherever you may be, and I'll see you next time. Bye.